Mercantilism is an economic theory practice, commonly used in Europe from the 16th to the 18th century that promoted governmental regulation of a national Euro-unregistered trademark-s economy for the purpose of augmenting state power at the expense of rival national powers. It was the economic counterpart of political absolutism. It includes a national economic policy aimed at accumulating monetary reserves through a positive balance of trade, especially of finished goods. Mercantilism dominated Western European economic policy and discourse from the 16th to late 18th centuries. Mercantilism was a cause of frequent European wars and also motivated colonial expansion. Mercantilist theory varied in sophistication from one writer to another and evolved over time. High tariffs, especially on manufactured goods, are an almost universal feature of mercantilist policy. Other policies have included building overseas colonies, forbidding colonies to trade with other nations, monopolizing markets with staple ports, banning the export of gold and silver, even for payments, forbidding trade to be carried in foreign ships, export subsidies, promoting manufacturing with research or direct subsidies, limiting wages, maximizing the use of domestic resources, restricting domestic consumption with non-tariff barriers to trade. Mercantilism in its simplest form was bullionism, but mercantilist writers emphasized the circulation of money and rejected hoarding. Their emphasis on monetary metals accords with current ideas regarding the money supply, such as the stimulative effect of a growing money supply. Specie concerns have since been rendered moot by fiat money and floating exchange rates. In time, the heavy emphasis on money was supplanted by industrial policy, accompanied by a shift in focus from the capacity to carry on wars to promoting general prosperity. Mature mercantilist theory recommends selective high tariffs for infant industries or to promote the mutual growth of countries through national industrial specialization. The term mercantile system was used by its foremost critic Adam Smith, but mercantilism had been used earlier by Mirabeau. While many nations practiced it, one leading exemplar was France, the economically most important state, where King Louis XIV followed the guidance of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his Controller General of Finances. They were determined that the state should rule in the economic realm as it did in the diplomatic, and that the interests of the state as identified by the king were superior to those of merchants and everyone else. The goal of economic policies was to build up the state, especially in an age of incessant warfare, and the state should look for ways to strengthen the economy and weaken foreign adversaries. Influence: mercantilism was the dominant school of thought in Europe throughout the late Renaissance and early modern period. Mercantilism encouraged the many intra-European wars of the period and arguably fueled European expansion and imperialism both in Europe and throughout the rest of the world until the 19th century or early 20th century. Evidence of mercantilistic practices appear in early modern Venice, Genoa, and Pisa regarding control of the Mediterranean trade of bullion. However, as a codified school, mercantilism's real birth is marked by the empiricism of the Renaissance, which first began to quantify large-scale trade accurately. England began the first large-scale and integrative approach to mercantilism during the Elizabethan era. An early statement on national balance of trade appeared in Discourse of the Commonweal of this Realm of England, 1549, "We must always take heed that we buy no more from strangers than we sell them, for so should we impoverish ourselves and enrich them." The period featured various but often disjointed efforts by the court of Queen Elizabeth to develop a naval and merchant fleet capable of challenging the Spanish stranglehold on trade and of expanding the growth of bullion at home. Queen Elizabeth promoted the Trade and Navigation Acts in Parliament and issued orders to her navy for the protection and promotion of English shipping. A systematic and coherent explanation of balance of trade was made public through Thomas Munn's argument England's treasure by foreign trade, or the balance of our foreign trade is the rule of our treasure. It was written in the 1620s and published in 1664. These efforts organized national resources sufficiently in the defense of England against the far larger and more powerful Spanish Empire, and in turn paved the foundation for establishing a global empire in the 19th century. The authors noted most for establishing the English mercantilist system include Gerard de Malines and Thomas Mun, who first articulated the Elizabethan system, which in turn was then developed further by Josiah Child. Numerous French authors helped cement French policy around mercantilism in the 17th century. This French mercantilism was best articulated by Jean-Baptiste Colbert, though policy liberalized greatly under Napoleon. In Europe, academic belief in mercantilism began to fade in the late 18th century, especially in Britain, in light of the arguments of Adam Smith and the classical economists. The repeal of the Corn Laws by Robert Peel symbolized the emergence of free trade as an alternative system. Mercantilism is a 20th-century economic policy that uses the ideas and methods of neoclassical economics. The new mercantilism has different goals and focuses on more rapid economic growth based on advanced technology. It promotes such policies as substitution state taxing, subsidizing, spending, and general regulatory powers for tariffs and quotas, and protection through the formation of supranational trading blocs. Theory. Most of the European economists who wrote between 1500 and 1750 are today generally considered mercantilists. This term was initially used solely by critics, such as Mirabeau and Smith, but was quickly adopted by historians. Originally the standard English term was mercantile system. The word mercantilism was introduced into English from German in the early 19th century. The bulk of what is commonly called mercantilist literature appeared in the 1620s in Great Britain. Smith saw English merchant Thomas Mun as a major creator of the mercantile system, especially in his posthumously published Treasure by Foreign Trade, which Smith considered the archetype or manifesto of the movement. Perhaps the last major mercantilist work was James Stewart's Unregistered Trademark's Principles of Political Economy, published in 1767. Mercantilist literature also extended beyond England. Italy and France produced noted writers of mercantilist themes, including Italy's Giovanni Botero and Antonio Serra. France's Jean Bodin, Colbert and other physiocrats. Themes also existed in writers from the German historical school from Liszt, as well as followers of the American system, and British free trade imperialism, thus stretching the system into the 19th century. However, many British writers, including Mun and Miss Eldon, were merchants, while many of the writers from other countries were public officials. Beyond mercantilism as a way of understanding the wealth and power of nations, Mun and Miss Eldon are noted for their viewpoints on a wide range of economic matters. The Austrian lawyer and scholar Philipp Wilhelm von Hornig, in his Austria Overall, If She Only Will of 1684, detailed a 9-point program of what he deemed effective national economy, which sums up the tenets of mercantilism comprehensively: that every little bit of a country's soil be utilized for agriculture, mining or manufacturing. That all raw materials found in a country be used in domestic manufacture, since finished goods have a higher value than raw materials. That a large, working population be encouraged. That all export of gold and silver be prohibited and all domestic money be kept in circulation. That all imports of foreign goods be discouraged as much as possible. That where certain imports are indispensable they be obtained at first hand, in exchange for other domestic goods instead of gold and silver. That as much as possible, imports be confined to raw materials that can be finished, in the home country. That opportunities be constantly sought for selling a country's surplus manufactures to foreigners, so far as necessary, for gold and silver. That no importation be allowed if such goods are sufficiently and suitably supplied at home. Other than von Hornig, there were no mercantilist writers presenting an overarching scheme for the ideal economy, as Adam Smith would later do for classical economics. Rather, each mercantilist writer tended to focus on a single area of the economy. Only later did non-mercantilist scholars integrate these diverse ideas into what they called mercantilism. Some scholars thus reject the idea of mercantilism completely, arguing that it gives a false unity to disparate events. Smith saw the mercantile system as an enormous conspiracy by manufacturers and merchants against consumers, a view that has led some authors, especially Robert E. Kelland and Robert D. Tolleson, to call mercantilism a rent-seeking society. To a certain extent, Mercantilist doctrine itself made a general theory of economics impossible. Mercantilists viewed the economic system as a zero-sum game, in which any gain by one party required a loss by another. Thus, any system of policies that benefited one group would by definition harm the other, and there was no possibility of economics being used to maximize the commonwealth, or common good. Mercantilists' writings were also generally created to rationalize particular practices rather than as investigations into the best policies. Mercantilist domestic policy was more fragmented than its trade policy. While Adam Smith portrayed mercantilism as supportive of strict controls over the economy, many mercantilists disagreed. The early modern era was one of letters patent and government-imposed monopolies. Some mercantilists supported these, but others acknowledged the corruption and inefficiency of such systems. Many mercantilists also realized that the inevitable results of quotas and price ceilings were black markets. One notion mercantilists widely agreed upon was the need for economic oppression of the working population. Laborers and farmers were to live at the margins of subsistence. The goal was to maximize production, with no concern for consumption. Extra money, free time, or education for the lower classes was seen to inevitably lead to vice and laziness, and would result in harm to the economy. Infinite growth. The mercantilists saw a large population as a form of wealth which made possible the development of bigger markets and armies. The opposing doctrine of physiocracy predicted that mankind would outgrow its resources. The idea of mercantilism was to protect the markets, but it also helped to maintain the agriculture and those who were dependent upon it. Origins. Scholars debate over why mercantilism dominated economic ideology for 250 years. One group, represented by Jacob Viner, sees mercantilism as simply a straightforward, common-sense system whose logical fallacies remained opaque to people at the time, as they simply lacked the required analytical tools. The second school, supported by scholars such as Robert B. Ekeland, portrays mercantilism not as a mistake, but rather as the best possible system for those who developed it. This school argues that rent-seeking merchants and governments developed and enforced mercantilist policies. Merchants benefited greatly from the enforced monopolies, bans on foreign competition, and poverty of the workers. Governments benefited from the high tariffs and payments from the merchants. Whereas later economic ideas were often developed by academics and philosophers, almost all mercantilist writers were merchants or government officials. Monetarism offers a third explanation for mercantilism. European trade exported bullion to pay for goods from Asia, thus reducing the money supply and putting downward pressure on prices and economic activity. The evidence for this hypothesis is the lack of inflation in the British economy until the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars when paper money came into vogue. A fourth explanation lies in the increasing professionalization and technification of the wars of the era, which turned the maintenance of adequate reserve funds into a more and more expensive and eventually competitive business. Mercantilism developed at a time of transition for the European economy. Isolated feudal estates were being replaced by centralized nation-states as the focus of power. Technological changes in shipping and the growth of urban centers led to a rapid increase in international trade. Mercantilism focused on how this trade could best aid the states. Another important change was the introduction of double-entry bookkeeping and modern accounting. This accounting made extremely clear the inflow and outflow of trade, contributing to the close scrutiny given to the balance of trade. Of course, the impact of the discovery of America cannot be ignored. New markets and new mines propelled foreign trade to previously inconceivable heights. The latter led to the great upward movement in prices, and an increase in the volume of merchant activity itself. Prior to mercantilism, the most important economic work done in Europe was by the medieval scholastic theorists. The goal of these thinkers was to find an economic system compatible with Christian doctrines of piety and justice. They focused mainly on microeconomics and on local exchanges between individuals. Mercantilism was closely aligned with the other theories and ideas that began to replace the medieval worldview. This period saw the adoption of the very Machiavellian realpolitik and the primacy of the raison d'être copyright in international relations. The mercantilist idea of all trade as a zero-sum game, in which each side was trying to best the other in a ruthless competition, was integrated into the works of Thomas Hobbes. The dark view of human nature also fit well with a Puritan view of the world, and some of the most stridently mercantilist legislation, such as the Navigation Ordinance of 1651, was enacted by the government of Oliver Cromwell. Jean-Baptiste Colbert's work in 17th-century France came to exemplify classical mercantilism. In the English-speaking world its ideas were criticized by Adam Smith with the publication of The Wealth of Nations in 1776 and later David Ricardo with his explanation of comparative advantage. Mercantilism was rejected by Britain and France by the mid-19th century. The British Empire embraced free trade and used its power as the financial centre of the world to promote the same. The Guyanese historian Walter Rodney describes mercantilism as the period of the worldwide development of European commerce, which began in the 15th century with the voyages of Portuguese and Spanish explorers to Africa, Asia and the New World. Policies. Mercantilist ideas were the dominant economic ideology of all of Europe in the early modern period, and most states embraced it to a certain degree. Mercantilism was centered in England and France, and it was in these states that mercantilist policies were most often enacted. France. Mercantilism arose in France in the early 16th century soon after the monarchy had become the dominant force in French politics. In 1539, an important decree banned the importation of woolen goods from Spain and some parts of Flanders. The next year, a number of restrictions were imposed on the export of bullion. Over the rest of the 16th century further protectionist measures were introduced. The height of French mercantilism is closely associated with Jean-Baptiste Colbert, finance minister for 22 years in the 17th century, to the extent that French mercantilism is sometimes called Colbertism. Under Colbert, the French government became deeply involved in the economy in order to increase exports. Protectionist policies were enacted that limited imports and favored exports. Industries were organized into guilds and monopolies, and production was regulated by the state through a series of over 1,000 directives outlining how different products should be produced. To encourage industry, foreign artisans and craftsmen were imported. Colbert also worked to decrease internal barriers to trade, reducing internal tariffs and building an extensive network of roads and canals. Colbert's policies were quite successful, and France's industrial output and economy grew considerably during this period, as France became the dominant European power. He was less successful in turning France into a major trading power, and Britain and the Netherlands remained supreme in this field. Great Britain. In England, mercantilism reached its peak during the Long Parliament government. Mercantilist policies were also embraced throughout much of the Tudor and Stuart periods, with Robert Walpole being another major proponent. In Britain, government control over the domestic economy was far less extensive than on the continent, limited by common law and the steadily increasing power of Parliament. Government-controlled monopolies were common, especially before the English Civil War, but were often controversial. With respect to its colonies, British mercantilism meant that the government and the merchants became partners with the goal of increasing political power and private wealth, to the exclusion of other empires. The government protected its merchants and kept others out by trade barriers, regulations, and subsidies to domestic industries in order to maximize exports from and minimize imports to the realm. The government had to fight smuggling which became a favorite American technique in the 18th century to circumvent the restrictions on trading with the French, Spanish or Dutch. The goal of mercantilism was to run trade surpluses, so that gold and silver would pour into London. The government took its share through duties and taxes, with the remainder going to merchants in Britain. The government spent much of its revenue on a superb Royal Navy, which not only protected the British colonies but threatened the colonies of the other empires, and sometimes seized them. Thus the British Navy captured New Amsterdam in 1664. The colonies were captive markets for British industry, and the goal was to enrich the mother country. British mercantilist writers were themselves divided on whether domestic controls were necessary. British mercantilism thus mainly took the form of efforts to control trade. A wide array of regulations was put in place to encourage exports and discourage imports. Tariffs were placed on imports and bounties given for exports, and the export of some raw materials was banned completely. The Navigation Acts expelled foreign merchants from England's domestic trade. The nation aggressively sought colonies, and once under British control, regulations were imposed that allowed the colony to only produce raw materials and to only trade with Britain. This led to friction with the inhabitants of these colonies, and mercantilist policies were a major irritant leading to the American Revolution. Overall, however, mercantilist policies had a positive impact on Britain, helping turn it into the world's dominant trader, and the global hegemon. One domestic policy that had a lasting impact was the conversion of wastelands to agricultural use. Mercantilists felt that to maximize a nation's power, all land and resources had to be used to their utmost, and this era thus saw projects like the draining of the fens. Other countries, the other nations of Europe, also embraced mercantilism to varying degrees. The Netherlands, which had become the financial center of Europe by being its most efficient trader, had little interest in seeing trade restricted and adopted few mercantilist policies. Mercantilism became prominent in Central Europe and Scandinavia after the 30 Years' War, with Christina of Sweden, Jacob Kettle of Courland, Christian IV of Denmark being notable proponents. The Habsburg Holy Roman Emperors had long been interested in mercantilist policies, but the vast and decentralized nature of their empire made implementing such notions difficult. Some constituent states of the empire did embrace mercantilism, most notably Prussia, which under Frederick the Great had perhaps the most rigidly controlled economy in Europe. During the economic collapse of the 17th century, Spain had little coherent economic policy, but French mercantilist policies were imported by Philippe V with some success. Russia under Peter I attempted to pursue mercantilism, but had little success because of Russia's lack of a large merchant class or an industrial base. Wars and imperialism. Mercantilism was economic warfare and was well suited to an era of military warfare. Since the level of world trade was viewed as fixed, it followed that the only way to increase a nation's trade was to take it from another. A number of wars, most notably the Anglo-Dutch Wars and the Franco-Dutch Wars, can be linked directly to mercantilist theories. Most wars had other causes, but they reinforced mercantilism by clearly defining the enemy, and justified damage to the enemy's economy. Mercantilism fueled the imperialism of this era, as many nations expended significant effort to build new colonies that would be sources of gold or sugar, as well as becoming exclusive markets. European power spread around the globe, often under the aegis of companies with government-guaranteed monopolies in certain defined geographical regions, such as the Dutch East India Company or the British Hudson's Bay Company. Criticisms. Adam Smith and David Hume were the founding fathers of anti-mercantilist thought. A number of scholars found important flaws with mercantilism long before Adam Smith developed an ideology that could fully replace it. Critics like Hume, Dudley North, and John Locke undermined much of mercantilism, and it steadily lost favor during the 18th century. In 1690, John Locke argued that prices vary in proportion to the quantity of money. Locke's second treatise also points towards the heart of the anti-mercantilist critique, that the wealth of the world is not fixed, but is created by human labor. Mercantilists fail to understand the notions of absolute advantage and comparative advantage and the benefits of trade. For instance, if Portugal was a more efficient producer of wine than England, yet in England cloth could be produced more efficiently than it could in Portugal. Thus, if Portugal specialized in wine and England in cloth, both states would end up better off if they traded. This is an example of the reciprocal benefits of trade due to a comparative advantage. In modern economic theory, trade is not a zero-sum game of cutthroat competition because both sides can benefit. Hume famously noted the impossibility of the mercantilists' goal of a constant positive balance of trade. As bullion flowed into one country, the supply would increase and the value of bullion in that state would steadily decline relative to other goods. Conversely, in the state exporting bullion, its value would slowly rise. Eventually it would no longer be cost-effective to export goods from the high-price country to the low-price country, and the balance of trade would reverse itself. Mercantilists fundamentally misunderstood this, long arguing that an increase in the money supply simply meant that everyone gets richer. The importance placed on bullion was also a central target, even if many mercantilists had themselves begun to de-emphasize the importance of gold and silver. Adam Smith noted at the core of the mercantile system was the popular folly of confusing wealth with money. Bullion was just the same as any other commodity, and there was no reason to give it special treatment. More recently, scholars have discounted the accuracy of this critique. They believe Mon and Miss Alden were not making this mistake in the 1620s, and point to their followers Josiah Child and Charles Davenant, who, in 1699, wrote, "Gold and silver are indeed the measure of trade, but that the spring and original of it, in all nations is the natural or artificial product of the country. That is to say, what this land or what this labor and industry produces." The critique that mercantilism was a form of rent-seeking has also seen criticism, as scholars such Jacob Wiener in the 1930s point out that merchant mercantilists such as Mon understood that they would not gain by higher prices for English wares abroad. The first school to completely reject mercantilism was the Physiocrats, who developed their theories in France. Their theories also had several important problems, and the replacement of mercantilism did not come until Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. This book outlines the basics of what is today known as classical economics. Smith spends a considerable portion of the book rebutting the arguments of the mercantilists, though often these are simplified or exaggerated versions of mercantilist thought. Scholars are also divided over the cause of mercantilism's end. Those who believe the theory was simply an error hold that its replacement was inevitable as soon as Smith's more accurate ideas were unveiled. Those who feel that mercantilism was rent-seeking hold that it ended only when major power shifts occurred. In Britain, mercantilism faded as the Parliament gained the monarch's power to grant monopolies. While the wealthy capitalists who controlled the House of Commons benefited from these monopolies, Parliament found it difficult to implement them because of the high cost of group decision-making. Mercantilist regulations were steadily removed over the course of the 18th century in Britain, and during the 19th century the British government fully embraced free trade and Smith's laissez-faire economics. On the continent, the process was somewhat different. In France, economic control remained in the hands of the royal family and mercantilism continued until the French Revolution. In Germany, mercantilism remained an important ideology in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the historical school of economics was paramount. Legacy: Adam Smith rejected the mercantilist focus on production, arguing that consumption was paramount to production. He added that mercantilism was popular among merchants because it was what is now called rent-seeking. However, John Maynard Keynes argued that encouraging production was just as important as consumption, and he favored the new mercantilism. Keynes also noted that in the early modern period the focus on the bullion supplies was reasonable. In an era before paper money, an increase for bullion was one of the few ways to increase the money supply. Keynes said mercantilist policies generally improved both domestic and foreign investment. Domestic because the policies lowered the domestic rate of interest, and it increased investment by foreigners in the nation by tending to create a favorable balance of trade. Keynes and other economists of the 20th century also realized the balance of payments is an important concern. Keynes also supported government intervention in the economy as necessity, as did mercantilism. As of 2010, the word mercantilism remains a pejorative term, often used to attack various forms of protectionism. The similarities between Keynesianism, and its successor ideas, with mercantilism have sometimes led critics to call them neo-mercantilism. Indeed, Paul Samuelson, writing within a Keynesian framework, defended mercantilism, writing, "With employment less than full and net national product suboptimal, all the debunked mercantilist arguments turn out to be valid." Some other systems that do copy several mercantilist policies, such as Japan's economic system, are also sometimes called neo-mercantilist. In an essay appearing in the 14th May 2007 issue of Newsweek, Business columnist Robert J. Samuelson argued that China was pursuing an essentially mercantilist trade policy that threatened to undermine the post-World War II international economic structure. Murray Rothbard, representing the Austrian School of Economics, describes it this way. Mercantilism, which reached its height in the Europe of the 17th and 18th centuries, was a system of statism which employed economic fallacy to build up a structure of imperial state power, as well as special subsidy and monopolistic privilege to individuals or groups favored by the state. Thus, mercantilism held exports should be encouraged by the government and imports discouraged. In one area economists rejected Smith well before Keynes, in the use of data. Mercantilists, who were generally merchants or government officials, gathered vast amounts of trade data and used it extensively in their research and writing. William Petty, a strong mercantilist, is generally credited with being the first to use empirical analysis to study the economy. Smith rejected this, arguing that deductive reasoning from base principles was the proper method to discover economic truths. Today, many schools of economics accept that both methods are important. In specific instances, protectionist mercantilist policies also had an important and positive impact on the state that enacted them. Adam Smith himself, for instance, praised the Navigation Acts as they greatly expanded the British merchant fleet, and played a central role in turning Britain into the naval and economic superpower from the 18th century onward. Some economists thus feel that protecting infant industries, while causing short-term harm, can be beneficial in the long term. See also, Neo-realism, notes. References, Ames, Glenn J., Colbert, Mercantilism and the French Quest for the Asian Trader, Braudel, Fernand, The Wheels of Commerce, Civilization and Capitalism 15th–18th Century, Breezy, Elise S., Mercantilism, The Oxford Encyclopedia of Economic History, Oxford University Press, editors, Encyclopaedia Britannica, Mercantilism, Encyclopaedia Britannica, Oxford University Press, Ekeland, Robert B. Har. Copyright Burt, Robert F., A History of Economic Theory and Method, New York, McGraw-Hill, ISBN A0-07-019143-3, Ekeland, Robert B., J.R. Har. Copyright Burt, Robert F., A History of Economic Theory and Method, Long Grove, Illinois, Waveland Press, ISBN A1-57766-381-0, Ekeland, Robert B. Tolleson, Robert D., Mercantilism as a Rent-Seeking Society, Economic Regulation in Historical Perspective, College Station, Texas, Texas A&M University Press, ISBN A0-89096-120-4, Galbraith, John Kenneth, Economics in Perspective, A Critical History, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, ISBN A0-395-35572-9, Grant, A. George, Tackling the Poverty of Nations, Why So Many Are Poor and What We Can Do About It, Xlip, ISBN A978-1-4363-3582-9, Hansen, E. Damsgaard, European Economic History, From Mercantilism to Maastricht and Beyond, Copenhagen Business School Press, ISBN A978-87-630-0017-8. Harris, Seymour E., New Economics, Keynes' Influence on Theory and Public Policy, Hecker, Eli F., Mercantilism, London, Allen and Unwiner, Hill, Christopher, 1961, The Century of Revolution, 1603–1714, ISBN A0-17-712002-9, Johnson, Harkey G., Mercantilism. Past, Present and Future, The Manchester School 42, 1–17, doi, 10.1111 per Joule 1467–9957.197 TB00098 Zhao, Kellenbens, Herman, The Rise of the European Economy, An Economic History of Continental Europe from the 15th to the 18th Century, New York, Holmes and Meyer Publishers. Keynes, John Maynard, Notes on Mercantilism, The Usury Laws, Stamped Money and the Theories of Underconsumption, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, London, Palgrave Macmillan, La Haye. Laura, Mercantilism, The Concise Encyclopedia of Economics, Library of Economics and Liberty, ISBN A978-0865976658, OCLCA 237794267 Lands, David S., The Unbound Prometheus, Technological Change and Industrial Development in Western Europe from 1750 to the Present, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press, ISBN A0-521-09418-6 Landreth, Harry. Cullender, David C., History of Economic Thought, Boston, Houghton Mifflin, ISBN A0-618-13394-1 Litwin, William, 1963, The Origins of Scientific Economics, English Economic Thought 1660-1776, London, Routledge, ISBN A0-415-31329-5 Magnusson, Lars G., Mercantilism, in Samuels, Warren J. Biddle, Jeff E. Davis, John B., A Companion to the History of Economic Thought, Malden, Massachusetts, Blackwell Publishing, ISBN A0-631-22573-0 Markwell, Donald, John Maynard Keynes and International Relations, Economic Paths to War and Peace, Oxford and New York, Oxford University Press, ISBN A978-0-19-829236-4 Nestor, R., The Great Frontier War, Britain, France, and the Imperial Struggle for North America, 1607-1755, Praeger, ISBN A. 978-275-96772-7 Nayans, Jawan Kortara G., A History of Economic Theory, Classic Contributions, 1720-1980, Baltimore, Maryland, Johns Hopkins University Press, ISBN A0-8018-3834-7 Amrund, David, The Rise of Commercial Empires, England and the Netherlands in the Age of Mercantilism, 1650-1770 Rothbard, Murray, Mercantilism, A Lesson for Our Times. Cheltenham, England, Edward Elgar, Samuelson, Paul, Theoretical Notes on Trade Problems, The Review of Economics and Statistics, JSTORA 1928178 Samuelson, Robert J., China's Wrong Turn on Trade, Newsweek, Retrieve 2007-12-06 Smith, George H. Mercantilism. In Hamowy, Ronald. The Encyclopedia of Libertarianism. Thousand Oaks, California, Sage. Cato Institute PPA 326 €8. ISBN A978-1-4129-6580-4. LCCN A208009151. OCLCA 750831024. Spiegel, Henry William, The Growth of Economic Thought, Duke University Press, ISBN A978-0-8223-0973-4. Vegby, Gianni. Groenewegen, Peter, A Concise History of Economic Thought, From Mercantilism to Monetarism, New York, Palgrave Macmillan, ISBN A0-333-99936-3. Walters, Robert S. Blake, David H., The Politics of Global Economic Relations, Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, Prentice Hall, ISBN A0-13-684712-9. Williams, E.N., The ANSIA Copyright N Regime in Europe, Government and Society in the Major States 1648-1789, London, Pimlico, ISBN A0-7126-5934. Zhang, Wilson, Charles, 1958, Mercantilism, London, Routledge and Kagan Paula, external links, Thomas Munn's England's Treasure by Foreign Trade, Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith's Attack on the Mercantile System, Mercantilism. List of references.